Okay, today we are starting section 3, which includes the European realm and the Russia Central Asian realm. And we're starting today with the European realm shown here. And this is a collection of countries generally covering the continent of Europe. We'll talk a little bit more about what is the continent of Europe and what's included, what's not. And it includes all of the countries up to Russia. These are what are included in this chapter, which is chapter 4. These are concepts, ideas, and terms for this chapter. And some of them highlighted, and even those that are not, I'd like you to make sure that you understand them as you do your reading. So back to this thing about Europe, that Europe is, let me move myself down here. Europe is the western part of what's called the Eurasia. And Europe itself is not truly a continent, but it is part of a larger landmass called Eurasia. We call it a continent, but that's more cultural or historical, where you have a lot of people living over here on this European side. You have a lot of people living over here in East Asia, not so many in between. So for historical and cultural reasons, we tend to divide it into two parts. One we call Europe, one we call Asia. Now, where we divide it is called the Ural Mountains. These are a mountain range that sit in western Russia, which happen to run north and south. So there's nothing magical about this as far as a physical boundary. It just makes a convenient line to use to divide Europe from Asia, because they happen to run north and south. These are the European regions. These include Western Europe, here in yellow. And these make up most of what's also called the European core. The European core is this area in red. And generally speaking, most of the population, most of the industry, and most of the wealth is concentrated within this core area within the circle. As you get outside of here into high latitudes or into rural parts of Spain or Italy, it's a bit less densely populated and there's less industry. It's more rural. It's kind of like, in a sense, that if Europe was California, this would be like LA or the Bay Area, and these parts outside of here would be more like the Central Valley in some ways. A little bit more rural, more agriculture, and less densely populated. Anyway, so Western Europe makes up much of the European core, including United Kingdom, France, Germany, and parts of other countries. You also have Northern Europe at really high latitudes. These are really getting pretty close to the North Pole here, with Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. You have Mediterranean or Southern Europe with Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and a few others. And then in this side here, you have Eastern Europe, which lies between Western Europe over here and Russia. So between Western Europe and Russia is Eastern Europe. And these are places that have gone through a number of changes during and after the Cold War, or actually going back to World War II. They've kind of moved back and forth as far as the being part of the Soviet Union, or part of the what are called satellite countries of the Soviet Union, to becoming much more independent today. And that's another theme that we will be talking about. Okay, so again, Europe, western part of the Eurasian landmass. And one thing to note about Europe is that it is a collection of relatively small countries. So Europe itself is not that big, especially compared to its neighbor Asia or Africa. And there are about 40 countries that are relatively small in terms of both physical size and population. The physical size of European countries are comparable maybe to a state in the United States. And the populations are also small when it comes to comparing to other countries of the world. So for example, the largest population, most populated country in Europe is the country of Germany with 80 million people. Now that's less than 2/3 the population of the country of Mexico, just for reference. Following that, you have France and United Kingdom, which are not that far off of the population of Germany. So the point being is that these are collections of small but fairly equal countries in terms of population and size. Now, because this is a collection of smaller countries, there are many efforts for these countries to work together as a single group. And these efforts to work together falls under the heading of what's called supranationalism. Supranationalism is effort by multiple countries to work together to a common goal. We will see some examples like the European Union, the European currency called the euro, and some others that are examples of supranationalism. A second thing that we will see is that in some of these countries, there are also pressures for the countries to split into even smaller countries. These are called devolutionary pressures. So for example, we will see cases where countries are in some regions of countries are voting to become independent, such as Scotland voting to become independent from the United Kingdom, and some other ones. And it doesn't have to be necessarily countries breaking apart, but it can be sub-areas of countries voting to get more autonomy or more rights. A third theme that we will be discussing is demographic transition. And this is something we introduced in the introduction lecture. We talked about in some parts of the industrialized world that people are having less kids, and this is slowing population growth. And this is particularly true in Europe, that in Europe you have low childbirth rates. This is causing a slowing of population growth, and it's resulting in an aging population and a need to bring in more people to work in factories and other jobs. And so one way that Europe is getting around the problems associated with low childbirth rates and low growth rates is by bringing in migrants from other parts of the world. Another theme that we will be talking about is Eastern Europe. And in fact, we'll probably talk about it more next week when we talk about the Russian realm, because we need to have that context of understanding the Cold War in Russia to better understand what is happening in this Eastern Europe, part of Eastern Europe. Okay, and then overall, the physical environment of Europe has diverse physical environments, diverse set of natural resources, and we'll also discuss how its physical environment and its relative location have historically encouraged trade with other parts of the world. So on that note, that the physical shape of Europe is one part of it that encourages trade, that it has a lot of contact with the ocean. In fact, Europe is like a peninsula being a piece of land that extends into the ocean. And not only that, it is a peninsula full of other peninsulas. And so there are a number of areas of land and islands and what are called estuaries. These are places where the ocean and navigable rivers meet up. And this collection of features that have a high amount of contact with the ocean make it easier for trade over the oceans. The second part of it is its relative location in the world, that Europe is really at the crossroads of what's called the land hemisphere or the northern hemisphere, where most of the land is and where most of the people live. And if we look at from the top, where North America, Asia, and so on are, that Europe is pretty much in the middle of that. So having good relative location has encouraged trade. Europe contains a number of what are called intropay or break of bulk points. These are places that are essential for shipping, where goods are transferred from one mode of transportation to another. The ability to move goods around within Europe, that is a concept related to what's called transferability. And transferability is a term you should know. It's about how easy it is to move goods around. Europe has an advanced rail system. It has wide and navigable rivers that goods can be shipped on. A second theme about trade with Europe is the concept of complementarity. This is where a region produces a surplus of goods that are needed in another place. And where you have high amounts of trade, or particularly where you have double complementarity, this is where you have two separate regions which produce goods that each other needs. And that helps to encourage trade because each one can fulfill the needs of the other. And lastly, that these locational advantages were helpful in pushing along the Industrial Revolution. That began around the 1700s in Britain or the United Kingdom then. Then it spread to Europe initially and then to other parts of the world. This is made possible by new technologies such as steam power. But it wasn't just about technology, but it was also about new ways of working, that people began to have specialized jobs where each person would do a very specific thing in a factory setting. Now, not only was it about the specialization of individuals, but there was also regional specialization, and that's called local functional specialization. This is where geographic regions specialize in producing certain goods that are needed in other places.